Go find another table, Clara. This one's for the family, not the hired help. My cousin Beatrice's voice was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the prestigious Austin cattle auction. Laughter rippled from the wealthy ranchers surrounding our table. I stood there, my face burning with a familiar humiliation. In front of the most powerful families in Texas, I was once again reminded of my place. My name is Clara, and I'm a veterinarian. And in my family, that's just a polite word for the help. I've spent my life as the survivor at their table. After my parents died, I was taken in by my Aunt Marion and my Uncle Silas. I was blood, but I wasn't their direct bloodline, and in the Texas Hill Country, that's the only thing that matters. I grew up in the shadow of their massive ranching empire. It didn't matter that my veterinary skills had saved their prize herds more times than I could count. It didn't matter that I knew the bloodlines better than my cousins, Beatrice and Warren. I was still the new they, the outsider, the obligation. That day at the auction was supposed to be a triumph for my uncle. Instead, he got into a bidding war with a rival, a stupid public battle of egos. When he lost, the humiliation was palpable. So to save face, he did something reckless. He bought the next animal up for auction, a prize-winning bull with an astronomical 6-figure price tag. The crowd murmured. It was an absurd purchase. Then my Uncle Silas stood up. He raised his glass not to the bull, but to me. To my brilliant niece Clara, he boomed. She has always wanted to contribute to the family legacy, so tonight she'll be covering this purchase as her contribution to the ranch. The silence that fell over the auction hall was deafening. Beatrice was smirking. My Aunt Marion nodded as if this was the most normal thing in the world. To my brilliant niece Clara, he boomed. She has always wanted to contribute to the family legacy, so tonight she'll be covering this purchase as her contribution to the ranch. And their casual destruction of my finances wasn't an attack. In their minds, it was just balancing the books. The crowd murmured. It was an absurd purchase. Then my Uncle Silas stood up. He raised his glass not to the bull, but to me. Beatrice herself walked the invoice over to me, her eyes glittering with triumph. Pay up, cousin, she whispered. It's the least you can do for the family that raised you. I stood there, paralyzed, the blood draining from my face. That 6-figure bill was my entire savings. The money I had scraped together for 20 years, the down payment for my own small clinic, my one and only escape route. Why didn't I scream? Why didn't I throw the bill in her face and walk out? That's what you're thinking, but you don't understand the invisible chains of the survivor. When you grow up as a guest in a house that should be your home, you learn that compliance is currency. You learn that your silence buys you a roof over your head. Your usefulness buys you a seat at the table, even if it's the one at the far end. I wasn't just paying for a bull. I was paying the rent I had owed for a lifetime of breathing their air. It was the price of my survival. My hand shook as I signed the check. My savings, my dreams, my one chance at freedom, gone. Wiped out to pay for my uncle's pride. I handed the check to the auctioneer, my face, a mask of calm I didn't feel. My Uncle Silas was already accepting congratulations from the other ranchers, his honor restored, paid for with my future. I had never felt more trapped. Just a moment, please. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the stunned silence of the auction hall with absolute authority. The auctioneer who had just taken my check froze. My Uncle Silas's triumphant smile vanished. Standing in the main entryway was my great-aunt Eleanor. Just a moment, please. She walked slowly toward our table, her back straight, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The entire room, filled with the most powerful people in Texas, held its breath. She didn't look at Silas. She didn't look at Beatrice. Her gaze found mine and held it. In that one look, I felt something I hadn't felt from this family in my entire life. Recognition. Then she turned to my uncle. I have watched, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner, as you have taken the name I built and dragged it through the mud with your petty ego. Eleanor Silas stammered, his face pale. I was defending the family's honor. You have no honor to defend, she stated, not as an insult, but as a fact. Honor is not found in bullying those weaker than you. Honor is not found in forcing your niece to pay for your own childish public mistake. Beatrice started to speak. But Grandmother Clara wanted to... Silence, Eleanor snapped, and for the first time in her life, Beatrice looked afraid. You have become the worst of them. Cruel without cause, vain without merit. Eleanor walked to the auctioneer's podium, took the microphone, and addressed the hall. My apologies for this distasteful family drama. But since my family has chosen to air their cowardice in public, I will air my decision. She looked directly at Silas, his face now ashen. I will be calling my lawyers in the morning. I am restructuring the entire inheritance. This ranch, this legacy, will not be passed down to those who value blood over character. It will go to the only person at this table who has shown integrity, resilience, and true grit. It will go to the only person who actually deserves it. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. A collective gasp went through the room. She set the microphone down and pointed at the check in my uncle's hand. Tear it up, Silas. But the sale, it's final, he stammered. Then you will pay for it yourself, Eleanor said. You will not pay for it with her money. She turned to me, her expression softening. Come, Clara. We're leaving. I was frozen numb. The world had just tilted on its axis. Clara, she said again gently, come. I nodded and followed her. As we walked out of that auction hall, I could feel every eye in Texas on my back. I didn't look at my aunt, my uncle, or my cousins. I just kept my eyes on the straight, steady back of the woman who had just changed my life. We drove back to the main ranch house in complete silence. She led me into her private study, a room I had barely ever entered, filled with old books and the scent of leather and cedar. She sat heavily behind her large oak desk. I'm dying, Clara, she said, with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used to dismiss my uncle. The words hit me harder than all the humiliation at the auction. What? Pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave me 6 months. That was 3 months ago. I have perhaps 3 left. Suddenly, her decisive action made a terrible, tragic sense. This wasn't just a spontaneous act, it was the result of a long internal struggle. It's a terrible thing, the regret of a guardian. For decades, Eleanor had watched me. She had been trapped between the hope that her family, her daughter, her grandchildren would eventually change, and the cold, hard truth of what I was enduring. She had seen my aunt and uncle's casual cruelty, their calculated neglect. She had watched them chip away at me, and she had waited. My pain had been the cost of her hope, but the cancer diagnosis was a deadline. It was the event that finally forced her to stop watching and to act. Her decisiveness tonight wasn't just about justice. It was about her own race against time, a desperate final move to right, a lifetime of wrongs she had allowed to happen. I am so sorry, child, she said, and I knew she wasn't just talking about the cancer. I waited too long. I thought they would see the value in you. I was wrong. She pushed a thick manila folder across the desk. Which brings me to the second reason I acted. Your uncle's public display of cruelty was a gift. It gave me the opening I needed to correct a far older, deeper crime. I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, bank statements, property deeds. Your parents, she began, did not die penniless as Silas and Marion led you to believe. Your father was a brilliant cattleman. He had just started building his own herd, a unique bloodline he was immensely proud of. When they died, they left you a significant parcel of land and a trust fund to see to your care. I stared at the papers, my vision blurring. The trust fund. The amount was staggering. Money that could have paid for my college, my clinic, a life. Silas and Marion were made trustees. Eleanor continued, her voice cold as ice. They were legally obligated to manage that land and that money for you. Instead, 10 years ago, they sold your land. And they emptied the trust fund. She pointed to a bank statement. They used your inheritance to pay for Beatrice's European tour after her graduation. They used it to cover Warren's gambling debts. They took your past and used it to fund their children's futures, all while telling you that you were a burden. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just that they were cruel, they were thieves. But the bull. I whispered my mind, connecting dots I never knew existed. The auction tonight. Yes. Eleanor's eyes were filled with a cold fury. I did some research after I learned of the theft, the bull Silas bought, the one he forced you to pay for. She slid a final paper toward me. It was the auction catalog showing the bull's lineage. It's from the exact same bloodline your father was building. The last of its kind. The air left my lungs. It wasn't random. It wasn't just my uncle's ego. This was a deliberate, calculated, symbolic violation. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had forced me to use my own savings to buy back a grotesque parody of it all while my cousin smirked. I looked at Eleanor, finally understanding the full scope of their darkness. I thought about what my life would be if she hadn't been there. Without Eleanor, the cruelty would have escalated. I would have been their machine, their endless ATM drained until I was broke and broken. My clinic would have remained a dream. My spirit would have been completely eroded. Her intervention wasn't just a gift, it was a rescue. It was the moment the ground beneath my feet finally became solid again. The story of what happened at the auction spread through the Texas Hill Country like a wildfire. In our world, land, cattle, and legacy are the only things that matter. The news that Eleanor, the matriarch of the entire region, had publicly disinherited her direct bloodline and handed the empire to an overlooked charity case niece was explosive. But the story that really had teeth was the one about the stolen land, the financial services and real estate podcast. The story was no longer just gossip, it was a scandal. My Uncle Silas and Aunt Marion, who had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of stalwart traditionalist ranchers, were suddenly seen for what they were: thieves. The backlash was immediate. Long-standing agreements with other ranches were suddenly under review. Their invitations to social events evaporated. In a community built on handshake deals and family honor, they had committed the ultimate sin. And so they did what desperate, image-obsessed people always do: they tried to control the narrative. They couldn't put Silas or Marion in front of a camera. They were too compromised. So they sent Beatrice. The story was no longer just gossip, it was a scandal. I was in Eleanor's study when her lawyer, Mr. Hayes, called to tell us about it. "She's going on the air tonight," he said, his voice grim. "They're trying to paint you as the villain Clara, the ungrateful, manipulative niece who took advantage of a sick old woman." "Let her," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly strong from her armchair. "A liar with a microphone is still just a liar. Give a fool enough rope, Mr. Hayes, and they will always, always hang themselves." That night, Eleanor and I sat in her living room and listened as the podcast went live. Beatrice's voice was smooth, practiced, full of false sincerity. "It's just been so painful, Mark," she said to the host. "My great-aunt Eleanor. She's a legend, we all love her, but she's not well. And this person, my cousin, has taken advantage of her fragile state. It's a tragedy." She spun a tale of a loving family, torn apart by a single greedy individual. She painted me as unstable, a troubled girl who had always been jealous of her and Warren. "We tried to include her," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We tried so hard to make her feel like part of the family, but she always held herself apart, and now, this." "Let's talk about the accusations," Beatrice, the host, Mark, cut in. He was a respected journalist, not just a friendly voice. "The rumors are specific. They allege your parents misappropriated a significant trust fund left for Clara by her parents." There was a half-second of silence. "That's a complete fabrication," Beatrice said, but her voice was a fraction tighter. "It's a misunderstanding. My parents managed her affairs, yes, but everything was perfectly legal. This is just Clara twisting the facts to make herself look like a victim." "So the land," Mark pressed, "the land left to Clara by her father. You're saying it wasn't sold?" It was sold," Beatrice stammered, "but that was for the good of the entire estate. It was a business decision. Clara wouldn't understand the complexities of it." "The complexities of selling land that wasn't yours and keeping the money?" Mark asked. "You don't know what you're talking about," Beatrice snapped. And there it was, the crack in the facade. "What I know," Mark said, his voice hard, "is that a young veterinarian in your family, who by all accounts is brilliant at her job, was publicly humiliated at an auction and forced to pay a six-figure bill for your father's pride. And now we learn that her inheritance money meant for her future was absorbed by your parents." "Absorbed, is that what you call it?" Beatrice's voice was no longer smooth. It was sharp, ugly. "We deserve that money. Do you have any idea what it's like to live up to this legacy? Warren and I have been here working this land, doing what was expected of us while she's been off playing doctor and feeling sorry for herself. She owed us. That money was the least she could contribute." The confession hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Eleanor looked at me and nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction in her eyes. "There it is." Beatrice must have realized what she'd done because she started backtracking immediately, trying to rephrase to soften the words. But it was too late. The host thanked her for her candor and ended the segment. It didn't take an hour. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. That single 30-second tirade where Beatrice, in her own arrogant, furious voice, admitted they deserved my inheritance, that I owed them. It was a public execution. It was no longer rumor. It was no longer a he said, she said. It was a confession broadcast live and saved for eternity. My family's attempt to control the narrative had just become the final, irrefutable proof of their guilt. Their carefully constructed world of honor and legacy had been burned to the ground by the one person they trusted to save it. Beatrice's podcast confession wasn't just a PR blunder. It was legal suicide. It was the final piece of evidence Mr. Hayes, Eleanor's lawyer, needed. The legal battle that my aunt and uncle had threatened to drag out for years was over before it began. The court proceedings were swift, almost a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. We had the bank records showing the systematic theft of my inheritance. We had the auction records showing the purchase of the bull. And now we had a 30-second viral audio clip of Beatrice herself, admitting they deserved the money they stole. My uncle's lawyers tried to argue diminished capacity on Eleanor's part, but Mr. Hayes presented testimony from 3 different geriatric specialists, all confirming Eleanor was sharper at 89 than most people at 50. The final devastating blow was the revelation of the bull's bloodline. When the judge heard that they hadn't just stolen my money but had deliberately forced me to buy back a piece of my own father's legacy as a final act of humiliation, the mood in the courtroom turned icy. It proved malice. It proved intent. The Fianc, the verdict was absolute. Eleanor's new will was upheld without question. I was the sole heir to the entire ranching empire. The civil suit was won. Silas and Marion were ordered to repay every cent they had stolen from my trust, with 22 years of interest. And based on the evidence of the theft and Beatrice's public confession, the county's district attorney pressed criminal charges. My aunt and uncle, the pillars of the Texas Hill Country, were convicted of felony fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. They lost everything: their inheritance, their standing, their freedom. Beatrice and Warren were publicly disinherited, their names formally struck from the family legacy they had prized above all else. They weren't just cut off from the money, they were erased. The great family, the symbol of old-world power in Texas, didn't just fall. It evaporated. And this is where I learned about the illusion of power. It's a lesson that sticks with you. Why did they crumble so fast? Why did an empire built over generations collapse in a matter of weeks? It's the difference between having and being. My family had everything. They had the land, the name, the money, the influence. But they were nothing without it. Their entire identity was built on a foundation of status they hadn't earned. Their power wasn't real. It was a costume, a heavy cloak rented with money and a name. The respect they got from their peers wasn't earned through character. It was demanded through their bank account. Their friends were just allies of convenience, loyal only to the power they projected. The moment the podcast exposed their character, and the moment the gavel confirmed the money was gone, that power vanished. They had no internal value, no integrity, no fallback. They were hollow. When the costume was ripped away, there was nothing left underneath. Silas and Marion went to prison. Warren, lacking any identity of his own, simply drifted away a ghost in his own life. And Beatrice. Beatrice, who had lived her entire life as the celebrated heir, became a pariah. She was a laughingstock in the very circles she had tried to dominate. The Fianc Quodonco, the verdict of the pasture, was final. They had valued bloodline over everything, and in the end it was the only thing they had left worthless and stained. Eleanor held on for another 6 months. She held on long enough to see the legal battles finished and to ensure the transfer of power to me was secure. She spent her last days sitting with me on the porch of the main house teaching me. She taught me about the land, not as a possession, but as a responsibility. She taught me about the water rights, the cattle bloodlines, and the handshake agreements that truly held the community together. She wasn't just giving me an inheritance. She was passing on a duty. When she passed, it was peaceful on her own terms, looking out over the fields she had tamed. I was now in charge, and I knew exactly what I had to do. My first act as the head of the estate wasn't to sell or to consolidate. It was to build. I took the full sum of the money repaid from my stolen trust fund, every last dollar they had taken from me, and I didn't keep a cent of it. I used it to establish the Eleanor and Clara Foundation. I was now in charge, and I knew exactly what I had to do. My second act was to find that bull, the one I had been forced to buy. He was still magnificent. I brought him back to the ranch, not as a symbol of my humiliation, but as the beginning of a new herd, the very bloodline my father had tried to build. I was finishing the work he had started. This is the real nature of justice. It's not about destruction, it's about creation. My family believed power meant holding others down. I learned that true power means lifting others up. They define legacy by what you owned. I would define it by what we build. The video doesn't end with me in a courtroom or watching my family fall. It ends with me 3 years later, standing on a patch of restored prairie land. I'm no longer the timid girl at the auction. I'm standing tall, my boots dusty, pointing out a grazing herd to a group of eager young veterinary students, the first graduating class of our foundation's scholars. They are listening, they are learning, and they are the future. Nearby the bull, my father's legacy grazes peacefully. The sun is setting, and the land my great-aunt saved and my father loved is thriving. this is my message. For all of you out there who have ever been told you are less than, for every person who has ever felt like they were on the outside looking in at a life you were told you didn't deserve. Your worth is not defined by the family you were born into. It is not defined by their approval, their money, or their name. Your true inheritance isn't something they can give you or take away. It's the strength you build in the shadows. It's the integrity you maintain when they have none. Do not let their failure of character define your future. Let go of the need for their approval. Go out and build your own legacy. Be the founder of your own empire. Because the ultimate justice, the greatest victory, is not watching them fall. It's living a life so full, so strong, and so true to yourself that their opinion of you becomes nothing more than a whisper in the wind.